online. Our members of Parliament are all online, and this is going to be an interesting process of shifting between the two media. Just because of the record, starting this afternoon, I'm Senator Marilou McPhedran, and I'm honored and delighted to be joined by a number of colleagues from the Senate here on the panel in person. And I'm also delighted and really appreciative of the members of Parliament at a time when so many of them have so many demands on their time in their constituencies right now for making the time. You can see that wonderful gallery there of the members of Parliament, as well as Senator Patterson, joining online. And in the center, interestingly enough, we have the wonderful Florian Eblenkamp, who is joining us from Geneva and will be the expert respondent on this panel. Florian is the Chief of Advocacy, Global Advocacy, for the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. So without further ado, here with us in the West Block of Parliament, we have the visionary publisher emeritus of the Hill Times, Jim Creskey. And I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Creskey now.
Well, you know, visionary floors me. Visionary. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marilou. Visionary. Old.
You started the Hill Times.
Yes. The old part is more important because when I look out and I see so many young people here, more than last year, and maybe more hiding behind the screen somewhere up there, I think about how my generation has really screwed this up. And it's a very serious problem, and it's really going to be your problem more so. I was 3 years old when the first bomb was dropped in 1945, because being 3, I had nothing to do with it. But along the way, we haven't really done anything to back up what is a very serious moral problem. Pope Francis mentioned that the very ownership of nuclear weapons is itself immoral. Not the use of them, but having them. And I think if you think about every country that has nuclear weapons, you know, we can all name them off, and every country that subscribes to alliances that use nuclear weapons, we have a massive problem to work with. I'm just so happy to see you young people here, and on this snow day of all days. So this is going to be tight. I'm told that there's only 5 minutes each per speaker. I was also told that we're going to begin this with MP Hedy, and then I have no idea who follows, so I think
it's on the list.
I follow this list. Okay. So why don't we begin, and I'll put my watch on the table and try to keep an eye out for the 5-minute mark. Okay.
Dr. Fry.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to use 5 minutes because it's going to be impossible to have everybody on the panel speak, have 5 minutes, and have any interaction at all. So I'm just going to say that when I was a young physician, I joined Physicians Against Nuclear War. At that time, it was called Physicians for Social Responsibility, which everybody thought was a little bit of a bogus name. So we went back to Physicians Against Nuclear War. And one of the reasons I joined was because I realized that worse than any pandemic the world would ever have to endure, nuclear war was the biggest public health threat. It was going to cause not only death to a whole number of people on the planet, it would cause chronic disease and chronic illness with people who survived and didn't die. And also it will be devastating from an environmental point of view to the planet itself, knowing how long a nuclear winter can take. If you need to remember, you said you were 3 years old when the first nuclear bomb was dropped. I was roughly that age as well. And I remember looking back on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we saw what a nuclear bomb at that time. It was not the same size in terms of megatons of nuclear arsenal that we have now. So we need to be really concerned. What for me is the biggest issue is that to talk as a physician, I already said it concerns me, but B, I want to talk as a politician. One of the things about politics is that we have 9 countries with a nuclear arsenal and 34 countries that are supporting them. NATO is one of the biggest alliances that supports nuclear war. And nobody wants to give it up because everybody feels that if they do, they will leave themselves open to the others not wanting to give up their weapons and that they would be vulnerable. And so everyone, it's a kind of like, you go first, after you, no, I won't, yes, you can, no, I won't. And we are still therefore stuck in that time warp where nobody wants to give it up. But secondly, I recall that we still have some tools that we can use, looking at, in fact, the United Nations Security Council that has been very clear on using other forms of war other than nuclear arms and nuclear weapons. They've been very clear about it. And they have a charter, as you well know. I don't need to tell all of you in the room about this. You have this information. You're well-versed and well-learned about it. But the second area we have is the International Criminal Court, that in fact can pronounce on any use of a nuclear weapon as an abuse to human rights and to human beings and humanity. So I want to say that we do have some tools. And as a legislator, I know that I signed on individually to ICAN. I signed out to Turning Back the Doomsday Clock. I have signed on to many things, and I'm going to encourage all the legislators in the room to talk to their colleagues and make sure they all individually sign some of these documents that put us exactly where we want to be in terms of making our statements clear, even though our countries, Canada is, United States is, and all of the 25 countries that belong to NATO are still involved in that kind of alliance. I think we need to think about what we do. I remember being a young woman in university when the doomsday clock was like 2 minutes to midnight over the Cuban Missile Crisis. That really shook me. It also firmed up my resolve about what could happen. And so I am very well aware, I know legislators are, but whether or not we can convince our countries to advocate from them, the NATO nations, to walk away, to follow the UN Charter against nuclear war, and to listen to the International Criminal Court, I want to say that it is of great concern to me today, at this time, that we are living in a world where the rise of authoritarianism is there, where the loss of democracy is happening, where we see many countries who are actually, we look at what Russia is using the threats and had to be stopped by the UN Charter. But we look at what is scary. I think when our neighbor to the south, United States, threatens us with economic force, and I do not rule out other force to take over our nation, we have to be really concerned that we're living in a very different world than I lived in, even in the 1960s, and that we were living in 5 years ago. The risk of a real nuclear war is very great. It's very high. More than ever, we need to redouble our efforts as legislators, as MPs, as senators, and as young people, because you are the ones who are going to live with a devastation if a nuclear war should ever break out, or the use of nuclear weapons in other parts of the world. The thing is, one person uses a nuclear weapon, the others are going to retaliate. And so I think this is a real problem. It's a real issue. It's a frightening issue because it will mean the end of humanity as we know it. And it's a dire threat to our planet. So even more than environmental threats and climate change, that are ordinarily done, seeing that free from industrialization. So I just want to tell you that I am vowing to you that I will continue to be an advocate. I've signed on to the ICAN. I've spoken about this. I've moved resolutions at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is made up of 57 states, well, 55 now that Russia and Belarus has left. But I moved all the resolutions to bring about some of the things that the Organization for Security and Cooperation Parliamentary Assembly signed on to. So I promise you I will continue, but we need to advocate with our colleagues. It's not good enough for my promise. I'm just one human being. We need to get our colleagues on side. You young people need to lead the charge. Push us, put our feet to the fire, make us move forward and do what we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. And Senator McPhedran.
Thank you. It has been such a pleasure this morning to see the resilience, the tenacity, in some cases just the straight-out courage to decide that this was where people wanted to be. And for those of you joining us online, we're equally grateful for your commitment of time and energy. For the parliamentarians on this panel, we come from many different perspectives. Some, like me, are not involved with any political party, and some are. And it speaks to the point that Dr. Fry just made about the need for parliamentarians to get beyond divisions and to hear from the people of Canada about what really matters. And we know the polling is very clear. The majority of Canadians are worried about nuclear weapons. The majority of Canadians want to see more from the governments, and they want to see action. And so this is an opportunity for each of us to address that. I'll just let you know that my timer is set for 5 minutes. So when you start to hear it ringing, that will help our moderator to be able to gently get you to close up. And my main point in the time that I have is that there's a question, and it hasn't yet been answered today, even though there have been experts addressing it. And that question is, how is it that Canada, as a government, across political parties that have formed different different governments, continues to rely on the Non-Proliferation Treaty primarily, when it has existed for 50 years and it is not functional? This, to me, is a conundrum. I don't understand it, but I think as parliamentarians, we really need to pay more attention to this central question. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you, everybody, for being here.
Great. Let's move on to Senator Dr. Osler.
Thank you very much, everyone. And as a physician, a parliamentarian, and a Canadian deeply committed to public health and global security, I want to bring a health lens to this discussion today and emphasize the grave medical and humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. The open letter that we all saw today from youth and civil society groups calls for decisive action on disarmament, and their concerns are not just political. They are fundamentally about human survival and health. Nuclear weapons are not merely instruments of war. They are a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. The detonation of even a single nuclear weapon, whether by accident, conflict, or miscalculation, would unleash devastating immediate and long-term effects, such as 1. Mass casualties and health system collapse. Mass fatalities, severe burns and injuries, overwhelming hospitals instantly. No health system, including Canada's, is equipped to handle the scale of injuries from a nuclear detonation. Infrastructure, including hospitals, would likely be destroyed destroyed in those affected areas. Second, radiation exposure and long-term disease. Survivors of nuclear attack have endured decades of cancers, genetic mutations, and chronic illness due to radiation exposure. Third, environmental devastation and food insecurity. The detonation of nuclear weapons would cause climate disruptions, potentially leading to what scientists call a nuclear winter, reducing global food production and leading to famine. Contaminated water and soil would make recovery nearly impossible in affected regions. In closing, the only cure is prevention, and we must recognize nuclear disarmament not just as a geopolitical strategy, but as an urgent public health priority. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you. And can we hear from MP Jenica Atwin, please?
Well, thanks. The random name kind of makes it exciting to see who goes next here. But
yeah, there's
really
no order in this, really. Usually I'm a journalist. I sit down there and just watch everybody get into trouble. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be here with you all. I'm joining you from the unceded, unsurrendered Wolastoq territory here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick. And really, I mean, I'm glad we also have Florian on our panel because I'm not an expert. I really come to this just out of concern as a Canadian, as a citizen of the globe, as a mother, thinking about future generations as well, and fundamentally as well as an environmentalist. I think of I'm part of ecocide and eco-justice initiatives, and I can't think of a more, a bigger example of what ecocide could be. This would be complete and utter devastation. And so that's really where I first got interested in speaking out and putting my name to these lists as well, and responding to constituents who are also deeply concerned. So this is part of the role that we have, is also putting people's minds at ease, giving them the information that they seek, because I do have constituents writing in about, nuclear winter and the fear of what that could look like. Many people are feeling incredibly anxious in these times. The geopolitical tensions, what's happening with our Canada-U.S. relations, all of these kind of tensions are heightening. And so I feel it. There's mental health impacts to all of this as well. I think of the health impacts we just talked about. And so really that's where I come to this conversation. And I also think about, again, I started by speaking about unceded, unsurrendered Indigenous territory. Who speaks for this land and who gets to make these decisions that would be irreversible. And a lot of the work that I do locally is actually around the development of small modular nuclear reactors here in New Brunswick, or the dream or the myth of these SMNRs. Again, because it's displacing critical resources away from the renewable energy we need to invest in, into sustainable solutions for our economy and environment for the future. And so some of the stats that were shared with us, that a 34% increase in spending on arsenals in just the past 5 years. Obviously, those funds could be diverted to things like food security, shoring up protections of things, housing, anti-poverty initiatives. And so it's a dangerous distraction. And so, it kind of fits into this conversation as well, because it's also about nuclear proliferation. And far too often, Indigenous communities are used as talking points. It's used as examples. And so, I just see all of this kind of always getting tied back, the interconnectedness of this conversation, because a decision to use a nuclear weapon would impact all of us. And so, I try to speak for the earth. I try to elevate the voices of Indigenous peoples who are deeply concerned about this. And I'm really grateful for this conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have MP Vignola.
Merci beaucoup. Ce sera la partie francophone que je traduirai par moi-même, par respect et politesse pour l'ensemble des participants. Merci d'être présents et présentes parmi nous. Je n'ai pas non plus, comme mon amie Jenica, je n'ai pas de passé de spécialisation concernant le nucléaire. Je suis enseignante d'histoire. Les enseignants d'histoire sont comme les Cassandres de la mythologie grecque. C'est qu'ils voient les choses arriver, mais personne ne les croit jamais. Pourquoi on les voit arriver? Parce que l'être humain, je suis désolée, malgré toute la technologie qu'on utilise aujourd'hui, parfois on est fondamentalement stupide et on répète exactement les mêmes erreurs du passé. Et c'est pour ça que je m'implique, c'est pour ça que que je vous soutiens, que je suis à vos côtés. Je ne vous demande pas de me pousser dans le derrière. Depuis des décennies, la crainte du nucléaire est présente dans ma vie. J'avais 9 ans lors de Tchernobyl. J'ai vu, c'était pas une arme nucléaire, mais j'ai vu ce que le nucléaire était capable de faire. Et en tant qu'enseignante d'histoire, j'ai aussi vu les images dévastatrices d'Hiroshima et de Nagasaki que je ne souhaite à personne, peu importe la génération. Donc, c'est pour cela que je suis à vos côtés, avec vous, pas en train de me faire pousser, pas en train de vous pousser, vous, mais au coude à coude, ensemble. Parce que c'est ensemble qu'on va réussir à faire changer les mentalités, puis à faire en sorte que les armes nucléaires ne soient plus jamais considérées comme une option possible. Et non seulement ça, mais qu'on va réussir à faire en sorte de les faire disparaître pour que le nucléaire serve ce à quoi il devait servir au départ, au bien de l'humanité et non pas à sa destruction. So now the translated part with my weird French, British, and Newfoundland accent. So I'm sorry. I'm not from I don't have a background, just as my friend Jenica, I don't have a background in nuclear, in physics, and so on. I'm a teacher, and I grew up with the fear of seeing nuclear weapons being used again. I'm a history teacher, and as history teachers, just as Cassandra in Greek mythology, we see things coming, but nobody believes us. Why we see things coming, I'm sorry, it will be quite rude, but even though we have so much technology around us now, human beings are still kind of, I'm sorry, stupid, because we do and redo and redo the same mistakes all over again in the same context. And this is why I'm deeply with you. I don't want you to push me. I don't need you to push me to fight against nuclear weapons. I want all generations to be side by side and fight together. So this is why I'm here. This is why I encourage you to talk with everybody. As a history teacher, I saw the impact of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I was 9 years old when Chernobyl disaster happened. It's not nuclear weapon, but it allowed me to see what a nuclear disaster can do. So this is why I'm with you now. Thank you very much to be involved, and to have the courage to be involved, and to maybe bring a small beginning, simply small beginning of an answer to Senator McPhedran question. Why isn't Canada able to apply what he signed for? Maybe he's afraid of what impact it could have on his friends. And my message is we should stop being afraid. We have, in French, we say, avoir un front bleu, which, Jenica, I don't know how to translate it, but have a big forehead, to just fight like bulls. We have to, with our words, convince the others and stop being afraid of doing so. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. And I would like to have taken one of your history classes, I think, just for the passion that must have been in them. How about MP Heather McPherson?
Hello, everyone. I have to apologize. I have a bit of a cold, and so my voice is terrible, so I won't take too much time. I'm joining you from, which is a very sunny day in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. I'm sorry to hear that Ottawa sounds like it's absolutely getting dumped on today. So I hope everybody's staying safe, and glad that we could do this virtually if we couldn't be there in person. I also wanted to thank Marilou and everyone who put this together. I really enjoyed being there in person last year. I'm sorry I can't be in person today, but I really think this is one of the highlights of my year, just to be able to see so many people so active and so engaged in an issue that means a great deal to me. Listen, I'm the foreign affairs critic for the New Democratic Party, as well as one of the advocates working with all of you on nuclear disarmament. And I have to say, what we've seen, even just in the last few weeks, has been absolutely horrifying. And it means that the work that we do to push the Canadian government for nuclear disarmament is vital. I look at what's happening in Trump's America. I look at the fact that he seems to be he is the most erratic, most unpredictable, least intelligent president I think the United States has ever had. And the fact that he is a megalomaniac with the power he has and the nuclear arsenal he has should terrify every single one of us. The fact that he is working closely with Putin, who has threatened Ukraine with nuclear attacks, is horrifying. You know, the rhetoric that he's been using with regards to Palestine and Israel in a moment in time where the Israeli government, Ben Gvir, the minister within the government, actually threatened the use of nuclear weapons on Gaza, despite the fact that the fallout from that would impact almost every single person in Israel as well. These are really dangerous times, and it's a terrifying time. I even saw on social media somebody saying, is now the time for Canada to get nuclear weapons because we're seeing such threats coming from our neighbor to the south. And I just thought, of all the things that we need right now, that escalation, that leaning on those weapons of mass destruction that would absolutely destroy the entire human race seems so devastating. And so I understand, I feel overwhelmed, and I understand how many folks may be feeling overwhelmed right now. And I have to think a little bit and settle my thoughts. I went for tea with Doug Roach, and many of you will know Doug as such a champion of nuclear disarmament for his whole career. And he said, you've got to look at the long arch. You can't get focused on the small things. You have to look at the long arch. You have to think about diplomacy. Every solution has a diplomatic solution to it. All of these issues have ways that we can work our way through it. That gives me hope. It gives me hope when I think about the work that ICAN does. I visited Hiroshima just a couple of years ago with ICAN and met with many of the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bomb. And that gives me hope and reminds me that there is work to be done, but that we are up to the task and that we can get that work done. I know there's more we can do to push our government. I know we can push our government on, not just the bare minimum. They should be at the TPNW, if not as observers, like actual members, actual participants. We've been pushing that a very, very long time. There is no reason that Canada can't be there. There's no reason, being a member of NATO does not preclude that. We have other NATO members that are there as observers. And now, considering what is happening with Donald Trump in the South, I think now is an excellent moment. I do have concerns when I look at the potential for a conservative government. I know we don't have a conservative member on this panel. I don't think we do anyway. And I do worry when their platform that they released recently said that they would take money from development and put it into defense. I think that's the wrong direction. I think we need to push a liberal government to act, but we also need to make sure that we are holding a potential conservative government to account as well. And that's where the work of everyone in this room comes in. This is where we all need to work together and make sure we're amplifying the voices of Canadians. So thanks for letting me be part of this. And again, sorry about my throat.
Thank you. And thanks for mentioning Doug Roach, who keeps hope alive for all of us. And I'm going to put in a plug for his book. The second edition is Keep Hope Alive is the name of the book, and he's got a postscript in the age of Donald Trump, so keep hope alive. And let's go on to Senator Pate, please.
Thank you very much, and I am no expert in this area. I was as in the 4 hours I was digging out of snow this morning, I was listening and constantly impressed by, I think it's what kept me going while I really, the muscles didn't want to continue digging out, and your press conference as well. Kudos to all of you. I'm here because it just makes sense to in a bigger scheme, whether it's social responsibility, equality, in so many areas. And as probably the way I first became concerned about this issue was I was a service brat. My dad was in the Air Force. We were stationed overseas, and every time the cruise missile came, we would talk about it as 12 and 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds at the time, about the fear of what would happen, because it was so clear that there was such danger just even moving those missiles around that everything was locked down on the base. We were not allowed to go to our swimming lessons. We weren't allowed to do our recreation. We weren't allowed to do, and my dad was a driver, so you can think of, I'd also be worried, like, and he couldn't tell me because it was top secret, right? Where missiles were being moved. Was he driving one of those trucks? Because he was a truck driver. And was he driving one of those trucks? And what happened if there was an accident? And then when I met Kim Fook, who often is referred to as Napalm Girl, now, I thought, wow, if that's what napalm can do, and, we all grew up with the stories of Hiroshima as well, what could result? And then, like some of the rest of you, when Chernobyl, when the meltdowns happen there, it really brings home that there's a lot of work to be done. So I just want to say thank you to all of you incredible young people and multi-generations who are taking the lead in this particular area of the fight for justice, because we need to do it across interests, across sectors, and you're doing that and leading the way. And I hope that our support in whatever way we can, in whether it's pressuring the government, whether it's just adding our voice. Of course, I think all of us have signed on to. I thought I had already signed, but I signed again today because I couldn't remember, quite frankly. And I want to thank you all for the leadership and the continued work on this area, and not forgetting to keep reminding us what's happening and how important this is globally, not just in Canada. So thank you.
Thank you. And Senator Wu, please.
Thank you to Senator McPhedran and all of you for this initiative and for having me and my colleagues on this panel. I remember when I was involved in CND back in the 80s as a university student, and there was a time, when after the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of us sort of thought that this issue has passed and we don't have to pay so much attention to it. But the very existence of nuclear weapons demands that we continue to pay attention, and I'm glad that there's a new generation and more generations that will focus on the question. I've just come from a briefing on the nuclear situation in Iran and how some people think that Trump will respond to it. It was a Chatham House discussion, so I can't tell you specifically what individuals said, but I'll summarize some of the key findings leavened with my own commentary. The bad news is that there's not a lot of optimism for me to share with you on the Iran situation. You may know it's been 10 years since the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was proposed by the P5+1, or what the Europeans call the E3+3. Trump pulled out of JCPOA. That was a disastrous move. And there's been a lot of backsliding since then, both on the part of the Iranians, who have continued to enrich uranium, and also on the part of the Americans, who have increased their economic sanctions on Iran. Unfortunately, there's no going back to the JCPOA. That ship has sailed. There's little appetite even among the Europeans to return to it for a variety of reasons that I won't get into. And we're now faced with a situation where the tinderbox that is the Middle East makes the incentive for Iran to complete its enrichment and weaponize its nuclear abilities has increased, and the pressure on the part of the Americans may well push them in that direction. Not to mention, of course, the ongoing threats on the part of Israel to execute what they call surgical strikes on Iranian facilities. The broader issue that we should all think about, and Senator McPhedran has touched on it, is really non-proliferation, the NPT treaty. I know that is not your goal, but there are some immediate challenges around proliferation that we need to face up to. The Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for many countries is a lesson in not giving up your nuclear weapons, right? Difficult as it is for us to accept, that is a conclusion that some countries have reached.
You need to talk with my voice.
That is a problem that will make it difficult for countries to voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons. The situation of DPRK in North Korea is particularly troubling because they are basically in the stage where they are looking at delivery systems. They already have nuclear weapons and making very rapid advances with the help of the Russians. Russia has, in effect, recognized DPRK as a nuclear state because they made the statement not so long ago that the nuclear problem is no longer there, which is in effect saying we recognize you as a nuclear state. And what that means for the region is that it will encourage the South Koreans and perhaps other countries to think about also going nuclear. So to get to my very small conclusion here, a lot of these problems are rooted in global injustices and in traditional ways of thinking about regional security, particularly in the East Asian sphere, where there's a particular conception of regional security that is essentially managed by American bases, like many American bases throughout the Pacific and on the mainland as well. The same, I think, can be said about the problem of regional security in the Middle East and how that exacerbates and incentivizes countries to have nuclear weapons. I'm not offering a simplistic solution to nuclearization, but if Canada is to play a role, it can't simply be to encourage them, to get rid of nuclear weapons. That's not going to work. It has to be about providing peace and stability in the regions where countries have an incentive to develop nuclear weapons. And currently, our foreign policy does not even conceive of that because we are so locked into traditional alliances and traditional conceptions of how regional security is pursued, say in the Middle East, particularly with Israel as the linchpin, or in East and Southeast and South Asia, where the United States is seen as the keeper of the peace. And on that controversial note, I'll pass it back to the moderator.
Thank you. And this certainly does lead into the idea of a culture of peace, and a culture of peace being multifaceted, having to do with income, equitable distribution of wealth, but certainly eliminating nuclear weapons is clearly one of the planks. Let's go on to Senator Coyle.
Good afternoon, everyone. it's really encouraging, as others have said, to be here with all of you, because really it's your voices that our Canadian decision makers need to hear, and we are here to help amplify your voices. And I thank Senator McPhedran for being the stalwart, organizer, champion of this very important cause. As a young woman, probably a teenager, I think it was, I got very afraid, as others have as well. I was a follower of Dr. Helen Caldicott, and the National Film Board film "If You Love This Planet." And I draw those connections today, to the work that, and it's been mentioned by others, the work we're doing on climate. If you love this planet, then you've got people like Catherine Hayhoe writing books calling "Saving Us." So don't just talk about the planet. It's actually, and we heard Dr. Senator Osler speaking about human life and human health, which is fundamental. So I am a senator representing the province of Nova Scotia. I'm a mom of 3 girls, 3 women. I'm a grandmother of 7 children, and I am thinking about them every day. I come from a background of social justice work, working with civil society largely around the world. And I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee with my colleague here, and was just at the same event as Senator Wu. And I'm on the Indigenous Peoples Committee as well. And like everybody at this table, I'm a member of Senators for Climate Solutions. I sponsored the chemical weapons bill, and I was the friendly critic on the cluster munitions bill. All of these things are connected. Every one of these things are connected. And what I'm worried about, frankly, is that we've been asleep for a long time. And that there isn't, yes, we all are concerned about this, but I'm not so sure that Canadians, in large numbers, think very much about issues of nuclear safety, nuclear non-proliferation, the banning of nuclear weapons. And I think it's really a challenge for us to find ways to reach outside of our bubbles, which we're really comfortable in. I like this bubble I'm in here with all of you, and find ways to communicate with people, to bring them in and find ways for them to take this up as their issue as well. Because as we've heard here today from our MPs and from the other panelists, the senators here, this is a whole new world we're in. And what's going on south of our border with that great disruptor who's, as has been said, highly unpredictable. The U.S. and Russia are the ones with the most nuclear weapons, right? And look at who's in charge of both of those countries. We used to tie ourselves, our foreign policy, our defense policy, like this with that of the United States. Can we continue to do that? We need to really think hard about what that means. And as our colleague said, develop a tough skin. I think that's a thick skin, I think is what the English translation was, a thick skin. And engage ourselves, be bold, be courageous, but also in doing that, find those connections with other people to bring them in, to learn, and then to act. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. And if that bringing people in, I think, is awfully important. We see the growth here just in the number of members of Parliament, the number of senators, the number of young people. That growth really has to continue, doesn't it? And waiting patiently in the online, Senator Patterson.
Thank you very much. And can you all hear me? I guess I should ask that first.
Yes, and see you.
And see me. Nailed it. You like the way I put no snow in the background, just to encourage folks. So anyway, good afternoon, everybody. And to the participants in here, I am very proud of you for stepping forward. Nothing can be truer than you are the voices setting the policy for the future. And many of us here were in your shoes at one point. And my background is actually in defense and security. I was a 34-year member of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I was a nursing officer when I started my career. And I figure I'll tell you a little story about what it means to be a Canadian and confronted not only with nuclear threats, but as Senator Coyle had pointed out, rarely do bad actors who want to use nuclear weapons just want to stop at that. They're looking at other weapons of mass destruction, whether it be chemical, biological, radiological agents, basically to act in an unjust and criminal way to decimate populations and as well terrain, which is really what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. So when I joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1989, the Cold War was ending. And so I grew up in the Cold War. And like Senator Wu had mentioned, we were out there with the nuclear disarmament groups, and the Senator Pate talked about those missiles being trucked around Europe. I remember the terrible fear we used to have as young people, trying to figure out what could we do to stop the actual fabrication and use of these weapons. Well, when I joined the military, as I said, 2 years in, the Cold War ended. And one of the first engagements that came out of that was the first conflict in the Persian Gulf, when, after many complex factors, Iraq attacked Kuwait. So Canada did commit troops to that. And very often you hear about the ships and the planes and all the other glamorous stuff that tends to go into what we know as conflict. But you probably didn't know that one Canadian field hospital, which is an army-based unit, was actually sent head into Kuwait to try and support coalition troops. And while that in itself is interesting, what was more interesting is we had every reason to believe that Iraq would have used weapons of mass destruction against us, including nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons. So can you imagine as a young, 21, 22-year-old trying to figure out how we actually treated casualties coming in? And this ties into Senator Osler's comments. And what could Canada do? What was Canada able to do to actually intervene to try and save lives and evacuate people out of an environment that could include any type of weapon of mass destruction? So Canada has had to work collectively in a coalition to figure out how we protect and treat Canadians during this situation. And you may think to yourself, well, that's just military people. But this is the reason why I bring this up, is because that threat has evolved massively today, which is what my fellow colleagues have talked about, is that there are threats from people we thought were our allies. What we have learned in the last little while is the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction has evolved exponentially. That trying to follow international law and order and humanitarian law has become a speaking point, that there's no enforcement to do that. And realistically today, we have a very simplistic approach to dealing with nuclear weapon proliferation, deterrence, and disarmament. And I can tell you, when I think about this, having been on the defense and security side, I stand with every one of you about disarmament being the goal that we must always strive for, always, always, always. But I also think that we need to call out for a more complex process and be honest with Canadians when we talk about it, that we start looking at disarmament, at deterrence, which includes non-proliferation, making it so abhorrent or so difficult or such high penalties that people different countries don't continue to add or join, or, well, if they've got a nuclear weapon, I'm getting a nuclear weapon. But lastly, and this goes to point 5 on the letter you have together, it's about engaging in thoughtful and transparent dialogue with civil society and Canadians on our nuclear deterrent policy. And because I come from a unique background, I'm actually going to talk about defense and deterrence. So Canadians at home have been, I would suggest, somewhat lucky over the years, being able to look elsewhere. It's someone else's problem. It's happening, in the past in Japan, or it's in the Middle East. But I'm going to also go to the point, look who our neighbors are and who the two biggest powers are. We sit right in between Russia and the United States. And as Dr. Fry had stated, if someone throws one nuclear weapon, there'll be another nuclear weapon come in. So I think Canada needs to be very thoughtful. And this is an area I'd like you to think about as many lines of effort moving towards the ultimate aim of disarmament is how can Canadians be aware of what the threat is to us? How can we properly defend ourselves? Because when it starts raining in, it's too late. So when we talk about dialogue within the community or what we're actually looking for in terms of platforms, and for Ms. McPherson, I'm going to go back to your point. This is about both international aid in the humanitarian security, the humanitarian aid, the social justice sector, that we try to create conditions in other countries and at home so that escalation of war doesn't happen, number one. And then we have to think about how do we protect Canadians? How do we invest in that? So if something were to happen, that we are aware. And my last point would be, just to put a fine point on this, think about many of us who are sitting here, as I am very mature and grew up in the Cold War. We do remember every now and again having an exercise in class. And if I said duck and cover, I bet there are a few people here who understand what I'm saying. I thought so. Merci, madame. And while this is certainly not to create any fear, I think as you were going out there and we're advocating for, as I said, the ultimate goal of disarmament is that we also have to look after ourselves here at home, and we have to have honest, sound conversations with Canadians and be transparent and demand of our politicians to start thinking about investment internationally to continue, but also to invest at home in defense and not see them as two separate elements, because in the long run, weapons of mass destruction are exactly that. They will end our lives as we know it. And on that rather grim note, I will pass it back to the moderator.
Thank you. I can actually remember ducking and covering under my 8th grade desk in 1954. And the idea of ducking and covering, of course, was to suggest to the population that we could actually survive all of this by ducking and covering, which was in no way true. The people who responded to that in the best way were the people who refused to duck and cover, and allowed themselves actually be arrested for not for going out in public. So, Florian, yes. Florian Eblenkamp, please.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to join you from Geneva, but of course I can't put in words the FOMO I have for not being in Ottawa with you. It's so encouraging to see that this summit is taking another edition, and I really hope to be back next year. I'm also very pleased with the parliamentary attendance in this call. It's maybe due to the complicated situation in Canadian politics that several of you have time at the same time. But so it's great that we can actually use this for something useful. I'm particularly also encouraged that many of you say very good things about nuclear weapons. I think I hope that it looks like some of our briefing papers are actually being read by political staffers and actually politicians. I want to start by saying that it's a truism that everyone always agrees on the risk of nuclear weapons, and especially now, many people everyone agrees that the risk is higher than ever. Maybe there's this doomsday clock that I think many Canadians have also heard of, that has now been set even closer to midnight just last week, and kind of summarizes the collective threats by nuclear weapons to humanity. Then we've heard on, of course, the war in Ukraine is still going on, despite what the American president wants it to be. Backed by nuclear threats, there's the issues with North Korea. There's, of course, Iran thriving potentially for a bomb, but not being far from that. There's, of course, also the modernization of nuclear weapons in every single nuclear weapon state. And at the same time, multilateralism is in a great danger. There's less and less countries that stick up for it. There's a credibility issue with the Non-Proliferation Treaty that hasn't managed to agree on even a single outcome declaration since 16 years. In 2010, it was the last time something was adopted there. And so we are at an impasse. Some say then, of course, I think Senator Wu has mentioned this, that Ukraine might be a lesson for other countries to also adopt this theory of nuclear deterrence and pretend to be less vulnerable from nuclear weapons. So I want to quickly debunk that myth that nuclear deterrence would actually keep anyone safe. I think it's actually only helping the aggressors, only helping those that are using nuclear weapons like Putin to intimidate and blackmail other states from stepping up for international law. The problem is with nuclear deterrence that in order to be credible, this policy always needs to be backed up by the constant threat to actually use a nuclear weapon. And if you think that's bad enough, but maybe not a no-go, of course it also will always incentivize even more countries to also adopt this strategy. So it's a very clear dead-end road that we would be going down if more countries adopted this. At the same time, if we continue like this, we still have to trust Putin that he's not going to do it. Can we also really trust Kim Jong-un in North Korea that he's not going to do it? Can we trust really also Donald Trump that he's not going to do it? Or is that even a risk we're comfortable to take? I don't think so. So I think in 2025, 80 years after the first bombing of Hiroshima and the development of the first nuclear weapon, it's a bit of a crossroad that we see ourselves at. We can, of course, promote nuclear deterrence more and kind of hope that everything goes okay, no one's going to do anything. Or we can try to shift the conversation a bit to talk less about the perceived military value of nuclear weapons and more about what nuclear weapons actually are, about the humanitarian consequences of these weapons, about the climate impact of these weapons, about the injustices that these weapons bring for indigenous communities, for women, for young people, and for less privileged nations. In a way, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is exactly that. It widens the discourse on nuclear weapons. It doesn't only look at it from a security perspective, but from other perspectives, such as an environmental perspective and a humanitarian perspective. Canada is not yet part of this treaty. We hope Canada will join this treaty in the future. And Canada, regrettably, has refused to join this conversation, even as an observer to this treaty. And I think that's really the most immediate step Canada can take. There's the third meeting of states parties to this treaty in 2 weeks, happening at the United Nations in New York. Some of the parliamentarians attending this meeting here will also attend the meeting of states parties in New York, and everyone is, of course, invited to join as well. But the Canadian government so far has refused to attend. Now, we have 2 more weeks to make a final push to bring Canada to the table. It's not about signing the treaty maybe at this point, but it's about becoming a part of the conversation. I want to acknowledge that the House of Commons has, by unanimous consent, adopted a motion in December on engaging the Canadian government more on this treaty. So as parliamentarians, be it in the Senate or the House of Commons, I ask you to follow up with the government, use your role as a supervisor of the government to make them do what you've tasked them to do. We cannot rely on nuclear weapons to never be used again. They've been used before, and with every expert you speak, they will tell you that they will be used again if we don't immediately act. So I want to close by saying Canada can do something. The TPNW gives an opportunity for Canada to try to dial back that doomsday clock. Canada should stop to pretend it's a nuclear weapon state and has to protect the interests of those nuclear weapon states. Canada is a sovereign nation that has its own foreign policy, that has its own nuclear weapon policy, and unfortunately, it has not become part of the conversation or part of the solution yet. It's time to change that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Well, we have about 15 minutes to open this up, so I'm hoping that you will have some questions. And there's a mic. Is there a mic there?
Senator Osler wanted just to make one quick comment.
You want?
I have a question if there's none immediately.
Yeah, no, please do. Two mics, one on each side.
Do you want her? She can go first.
Okay, yeah.
And introduce yourself, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Is that good? Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the panel. It was very, very insightful and for being here today to talk to everyone about this issue. My name is Daria. I'm here with IPPWC, but I'm actually also a Master's of Science candidate at Harvard Public Health School. So I'm Canadian, but I'm on the other side of the border right now, which is interesting. I won't delve into that too much. I think my question comes from actually something that one of the speakers said, which is about this idea that we've been asleep for too long and that Canadians don't really think about this in large numbers. And I think that's something that, having worked with civil society, we really see that there is a push for this. And then we also know that there's clearly a push for this in government. There's a discussion about this. And yet so many people don't know about this issue. And I think a big part of that is also due to transparency. This is a scary issue. This is something that is uncomfortable to talk about. But I think it's very, very necessary to talk about. And I think we have people like the youth in this room who are willing to fight for this. But if the rest of the Canadian population doesn't see this as an issue, no one's really going to follow these civil society missions or necessarily the government's missions either in this situation. So my question, sorry for the very long-winded introduction to all of this, is what do you think is the role of government in pushing for transparency and education on these issues, given the scale of the large-scale issue that this is? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And it might be a little difficult to organize it, but anyone on the panel and online can respond to any of these questions. How we do that? Okay, so okay, we have two hands.
You need to call them then. Fry, Vignola, and McPherson.
Right. Okay, Fry, Vignola, McPherson. In that order.
Thank you. I think the only, and I'm going to be blunt, the only message that governments get is from the voter. The only way to get government's attention is to make something a ballot box issue. It has to be something that people are going to say, you got to do something about, or we won't vote for you. Now, that's the blunt answer. But I do think government has a huge role to educate the public, because most of the public, I mean, everyone said, polls say that people care. They care, but they care in a very passive, 64,000 miles up in the air manner, generic way. They don't know the issue. They don't understand the issue. And so government has a duty, actually, in the same way we do with public health, to educate the public about the problems that would happen if there's a nuclear war or if we use nuclear arms. Unfortunately, nobody's paying attention, and I think it's going to be up to us as parliamentarians to push the button on having some round tables or some public discussion on this. We could get together, those of us who are in the Canadian Parliamentarians Against Nuclear War can come up together and talk about doing joint public consultations with people on it, having roundtables like this virtually and talking to the public, educating them and getting them on side before governments will take a road in any way, shape, or form. Thanks.
I'm jumping in here for a very quick question to all of you, and if you could address it when you answer, and that is, does anyone on this panel not agree that Canada should be sending observers to the meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? There is a global parliamentarians meeting all day on March 3rd, and the actual meeting of states parties. So we're not a states party, but several of the NATO countries consistently send official observers. And certainly, as Heather McPherson knows, because we've been involved in this for years together, quite clearly Canada refuses. Who thinks that's okay?
Rapidement, étant donné que c'est mon tour de répondre, et encore là, je vais m'auto-traduire. Je devais être présente le 3 mars. I was supposed to be there on March 3rd. I hoped to be able to be there, and I can't, which is, I have non-parliamentarian words in my head to explain how I feel about the fact that I will not be there. So I will not say them, even in French. I'm sorry. But yes, we have, government has to educate. Well, as a teacher, I would say we have to make a difference between education and instruction. But we have to make the information available, which is, I think, usually better than it was before. However, it's not because you let the information being accessible that people will go and take a look at that information. So you have to be sure by instruction, among other things, that the information is available and to show how to pick it. In French, we call it méthodologie du travail intellectuel. So if I try to translate word by word, it will be atrocious. Kind of intellectual work methodology, something like that, have to be taught better ways. And by informing, instructing people, I mean not use fear. Never use fear. Information, fact, no emotions. People will rely by themselves on emotion and it will make them move. But the government must never use fear. That's it.
Merci.
Shall I jump in now as well?
Yes.
Yes, thanks. First of all, I would really like to hear those non-parliamentary words in French because I'm working on my French and I think that would be very helpful for me to know some of those. So maybe on the next question. First of all, Marilou, what you were saying, should Canada be there? Of course they can. Now, you said that the Canadian government has refused to attend, and that's absolutely true. But I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is they haven't actually explicitly refused. They just don't respond. Like they just sort of sit like a rabbit and pretend that if they're really still, no one will pay attention. Because we were never really even told in the last one that they weren't coming. It was until the very end. It was more, we're looking at it, rather than actually act. And I think that's a place where we can put some pressure on the government, is demand that they provide a response as fast as possible. But I want to just bring up one thing about this. When you talk about engaging Canadians, this system of engaging Canadians in global citizenship was broken on purpose. It was broken during the Harper government. They cut public engagement funding from across the country massively, and they did it in a very strategic way. We used to have things like multimedia initiatives. We used to have things like journalist initiatives, schools, post-secondary institutions, all used to do a lot of public engagement, and they don't now. And so people aren't talking about what it means to be a global citizen, what it means to play an important role on the world stage. And because we're not talking about it, because we're not learning about it, we stop caring about it. And that was done on purpose. And so one of the things we need to do is make sure that we're reinvesting in making sure those conversations are happening across Canada, making sure public engagement and a discussion about multilateralism and Canada's role in the world and what it means to be a global citizen are part of the discussions that children hear, that adults hear, that we hear in multiple different fora. So I think that's an important note too.
Thank you. And Senator Dr. Osler.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of the panelists. And my question is for Florian with ICAN. We've heard about the need to bring this into everyday conversations. We've heard about fear. This is a scary subject. We've heard about a lack of information transparency and the climate crisis. And even a limited nuclear exchange could trigger a nuclear winter with severe climate disruptions leading to famine, disease outbreaks. And my question is, how can we better integrate conversations about nuclear disarmament into climate justice and public health advocacy?
Thank you so much. Can I just go ahead and respond?
Yeah, please.
It's an excellent question. So I think there's many different layers where we can do that. One is this very, very effective Canadian civil society organization, IPPNWC, that works exactly on this link between nuclear disarmament and health issues. They're, of course, part of a global network, also part of ICAN, where this is being discussed. They are in the process of establishing a parliamentary group exactly on this issue. So I'm sure it's open to senators, and I'm sure colleagues of you have actually joined that and hosted that group. So there'll be a parliamentary start. At the same time, parliaments often work in boxes, right, in committees. So why not talk about nuclear weapons in the Canadian Health Committee or in the Civil Protection Committee rather than only in the Foreign Affairs Committee? I think it would be an interesting discussion and maybe a very fruitful exchange of expertise that cuts across these issues. And then I want to come back to the TPNW, which is exactly that, taking the nuclear weapon out of its singular issue where it's treated as a military security prescription. It's a fundamental part of this treaty is the Articles 6 and 7 that deal with environmental compensation and victim assistance, where those communities that have been harmed by nuclear weapons use and testing, and in fact along the entire life chain of a nuclear weapon, would be assessed, and that's the debate at the upcoming meeting of states parties, or one of the debates at the upcoming conference, is how compensation can look like. So it's not only a disarmament treaty, it's also a nuclear justice treaty, and therefore I think really a treaty for the 21st century. And yeah, it'd be great if Canada can make its expertise heard at that meeting and contribute. Thank you.
I just would like to jump in for one moment. Sorry, Rama, but Christian, am I correct that you chair the working group on 6 and 7? You co-chair the working group on 6 and 7. So I'm wondering if you might take a moment and explain a bit more about the point that Florian made, since that's the work you're doing at the United Nations.
Sure. So,
Mike, you need the mic, Christian. For parliamentarians that were not here this morning, this is Christian Charbonneau, who is with the Reverse the Trend, which is the entirely youth-led, youth-focused organization, one of our co-hosts today, that was created by the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. Christian.
I also have another hat as well.
You do.
As co-chair, I serve as the TPNW advisor for the mission of Kiribati, which co-chairs the working group with Kazakhstan. And as Florian mentioned, one of the topics will be on financial compensation, looking at what an international trust fund would look like. And one of the key questions is how can countries like Canada contribute to such a fund, either through expertise or through financial assistance to help those who've been impacted by nuclear weapons. And this has been an ongoing discussion at the United Nations, especially both through the TPNW and the UN General Assembly's First Committee resolution on victim assistance and environmental remediation, which Canada voted in favor. And Canada, as everyone knows in this room, has had a long-standing history of helping victims, be it landmines and so forth, as well as serving as the middle power. And through contributing and helping with Articles 6 and 7, it is possible for the Canadian government, even if it's not ready, even though it may not be ready to join the treaty yet, to at least signal and to provide a sign of goodwill by helping those who've been affected by nuclear weapons.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. And I think we have time for two more questions. So here and there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rama Faisal. I'm an intern at the Office of Senator McPhedran. I wanted to thank you for all the panelists for coming here today. My question was with regards to Canada's nuclear policy. So as you know, Canada relies on the NPT and NATO obligations to form its nuclear policy. And as we've discussed through this panel today, and as Senator McPhedran stated, that NPT is not currently effective. So my question to the speakers here today is, do you think that Canada can afford to step out of its obligations to NATO obligations for collective nuclear strategy? Can Canada afford to walk away from those obligations, and specifically within our current political climate? Thank you.
Who would like to feel that?
Yeah, well, I think they're going to be very different.
Do you want to feel that and do two questions at the same time, or?
I think they're going to be really different.
Yeah, I think so too. So, who wants to take up the NATO question? NATO, if I understand it correctly, has first strike nuclear policy, and that the nuclear weapons in Europe are basically American controlled, even though they are under NATO surveillance. How?
Senator Patterson.
Senator Patterson.
I think it's actually an extremely good point. Now, I guess my question back to you is, when you say pull out of it, as you know, it's about first strike, but it also has a follow-on component to it. So you have to apologize. I did just pull it up so I could refresh my memory. But it also talks about the consequences of those weapons, the impact of weapons if they're used is a shared responsibility by the home NATO nations, which could then fall down into compensation as well. And if we pull out of it, does it mean that we don't believe in it, if we can't become part of or stay part of NATO? I actually think maybe the better question is, does this need to be renegotiated given the current really unpredicted environment that we find ourselves with, that people with the fingers on the buttons of most of the nuclear weapons in the world are friends and allies are merging together, and with our not-so-friendlies and not-so-allies. So can you be part of NATO and not be part of that? Well, as a NATO member, as you also know, is each country is still treated as a sovereign country. And so if there is that political decision made with, again, civil society truly would need to push for something like that, understand the true costs and benefits for it, Canada could by all means step back for that. And Canada would need to be able to balance that against what are the consequences to us for not being in line with the existing policy. But I think you've brought up an extremely good point. And one of the groups that I do is the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where we help to create policy that influences our own governments collaboratively with other NATO nations. And I actually think that there may be time for us to pull this out, blow the dust off it, and have a look at it again. That isn't the exact answer you wanted, but I can tell you those are kind of parameters within which Canada would need to have a look at and work through. And again, I go back to those who are within the House of Commons, especially our critics for foreign affairs, on what the thoughts would be about getting into that space and bringing it up as a point of needs review given the current situation. Thanks.
Thank you. And we are going to have more than two questions, and we're just going to next.
Yeah, this is working. Hi, I'm Peyton Bragg. I'm from Selkirk, Manitoba. One of you guys talked about how we have not been awake and how we need education to basically wake up. But as youth, what can I and other people do to educate our peers and older people around us to truly understand the reality bombs have on us? Since I feel like my voice is only so small, and since I'm young, I might not be taken as seriously as an adult would.
Anyone? Yeah.
Si vous me le permettez, je vais y aller. En français, on dit qu'on n'attire pas les abeilles avec du vinaigre. So, bees, you cannot attract bees with vinegar. Alors, lorsqu'on parle à d'autres jeunes, lorsqu'on parle à des adultes, si on a une approche qui est agressive, épeurante, ça ne marchera pas. Il faut les faire réfléchir. So when we talk to adults and to other young people, if we have kind of aggressive or fearful, approach, it doesn't work. Just vinegar with bees doesn't work. A little bit of honey, so information. Let them think. So what do you know about nuclear weapons? Do we have some here in Canada? What are the impacts? What happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? You would be so surprised how many people doesn't even know about Nagasaki, Hiroshima, or even about Chernobyl, or that there was a nuclear bomb that was accidentally dropped into the St. Lawrence River 60, 70 years ago. Nobody knows. And it's in front of Saint Henri. I was living in Saint Pascal, just 16 kilometers away from there, So nobody knew. So you have to inform and not doing in an aggressive way. And if they don't know, this is the perfect time to let them know and bring them with you. So this is something new for you. Good. Would you like to work with me? Would you like to send a letter to UMP? Because I'm reading every one of my emails, taking a lot of time, but I do. But I suppose I'm not the only one in 338 doing so. So bring people with you, okay? And you might even learn from them. So don't just be a bee with honey, not vinegar.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the answer is, apart from these tables, we also need the dinner table as well. And yes,
just to build on that. Just to build on that wonderful answer and that very important question. Yes, of course, bees are more attracted to honey than to vinegar, and yes, I agree with that. But I think building on the last thing that she said, find out what's important to them, and find that point of connection, because this is it somebody who's worried about their safety? Is it somebody who's concerned about health? Is it somebody who's bigger picture worried about the world we live in? Is it somebody who's concerned about Donald Trump? What is that point of concern that person has, or interest that person has, and then connect this topic with that, in a way that's meaningful to them. That's usually, to me, that's the best way. And try to reach out to the not so usual suspects, right? Not just the person who's attracted to an event like this. That is a wonderful thing that you are attracted to this. But then we all need to be emissaries, right? But emissaries who are listening as much as we're speaking, right? So that we know what to say once we know where the point of connection is.
Thank you for your responses and time.
yes.
So, one of the challenges that I see, and this is where when we talk about working across sectors is really important, public interest in this issue is partly driven by what people have the bandwidth to be able to think about. Exactly. And as more and more people are struggling just to survive, not not even thrive in the country, it's not a surprise that we're not seeing this as top of mind. And so it really underscores the need to link together different sectors as well. Because I was struck while the discussion was happening, and at the same time I'm getting a new notice coming up about a Harvard study showing that the incarceration rates of poor and working class men white working class men is going up. Well, guess who's predominantly voted for what's happened south of the border? And so as we're creating more disaffected populations, they're also disengaged from these very issues. So having to link into the social, economic, and health policies of our country as well, I think will be vitally important for people to be able to think beyond their own small sphere.
Yeah, so it's a precondition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And MP Hedy Fry.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on something that Senator Pate just said. I agree with her fully. You've got to engage the public when they wish to be engaged. Right now, everyone is thinking about the bread and butter issues, about what is going to happen with Trump, what's going to mean to their jobs when the tariffs are imposed. They're worried about getting food on the table. They're worried about healthcare, frontline workers. So there has to be a way to engage them and to get them to see that this is a real problem. Right now, it isn't. And one of the issues that I think somebody else brought up is that we have a lot of young people who don't get education in school about history, about what went on, what happened. They don't know about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They don't know anything about even the Holocaust. There's a lot of Holocaust denial going on. Like this never happened. You guys are making it up. So we need to find a way to engage people. I think governments could look at, federal government has no role in this, but governments should look at education of history in the schools to teach kids about the reality of what's going on so you can get a lot of people interested. But I wanted to also comment about the question about opening up negotiations with a NATO agreement amongst parties. I don't think that's going to happen, because with the kind of situation we're in right now, where countries are concerned about war, they're concerned about aggressive movements, about sovereignty, etc., and with all the conflict going on in the world, no one's going to want to talk about this issue. And I don't think that we would want to open up something where we could have a big country like the United States threatening to suggest that a NATO country can move against the sovereignty of another NATO country, like Putin has done Ukraine is not a NATO country, but that there's a threat that we have in Canada here of our own existential threat about a NATO ally looking at going against and annexing Canada as a 51st state. Nobody's going to want to open up a negotiation on something that can allow a big bully like the United States to suddenly decide that they want to remove Section 4 of NATO, the NATO agreement. So these are problems that are practical. Politics is the art of the possible.
Thank you. And we have, do we have two questions or a joint question? One question. Okay.
We are Lord Selkirk Regional. My name's John. This is Amelia, and we're from Selkirk, Manitoba.
So, throughout this event, we have heard a lot of accounts on how people have been affected by nuclear testing and uranium mining. We have just been wondering if these people should be or have they been compensated in some sort of form. Thank you.
Does anyone have an answer to that question? Florian.
Yeah, I have maybe a rough answer. The general answer is no. It's actually quite shameful, I think, for those states that have tested nuclear weapons and used nuclear weapons, that not only have they refused to compensate financially or emotionally or through other means those communities, but the practice has been to simply deny that those tests have taken place, that these tests have been harmful, and to withhold data that would allow at least for an assessment of the mess that has been created. So some of the people I speak to, for example, from the Pacific Island states, and Christian can maybe elaborate on that more. Their immediate concern is that, for example, the French government does not release data on the nuclear tests that have been carried out there, nor where they have been tested, where these tests have been conducted, and to what magnitude. And yet, you see clusters of cancer rates jumping up. There's a very obvious causal connection. There's also the same with indigenous groups in Algeria that have been disregarded in this case, and of course in the United States and in Australia, where the UK has tested their nuclear weapons. So the very short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that we're working on it, and the CPW might be a good tool to do this, because it takes because it gives the agency to those who have been affected, and no longer has to wait for the nuclear weapon states to get their act together and move their positions on this. If I may, I just wanted to quickly comment on this NATO policy thing, just to clarify that there's nothing in the NATO treaty that would, require Canada or any NATO state to support nuclear weapons as a means of defense. Quite the opposite. There's a minority of countries in NATO, 3, that have nuclear weapons. There's a few more that have nuclear weapons on their territory. But the vast majority doesn't have nuclear weapons, doesn't have anything to do with them. And there's 2 countries, Spain and Lithuania, that have a constitutional ban on nuclear weapons on their territory, plus I think 3 more, Denmark, Norway, and Portugal, that have a ban in the constitution on nuclear weapons in their territory in peace times. So there's, as on every foreign policy issue, there's a range of positions, and there's really no reason why NATO shouldn't have different positions on this treaty. So let's not be deterred by this NATO argument.
Oh, it's not a question. It's just a response to the comments around compensation. Just sharing an experience from my community. My community has, when the refinery was built, we had a memorandum of understanding that was signed between our chief of the day and the corporation, but it just had, I guess, a commitment to meet twice a year. There was no commitment to support Mississauga First Nation with any financial resources that would contribute to our Lands and Resources Department to be able to do any environmental monitoring, any programs, or conducting any health studies. Since then, we haven't come to a place where we've reached any agreement with the corporation, so we do not receive any sort of compensation for the loss of our land and that area. We're still working really hard to try and find ways to address the environmental and health concerns. Right now, if we wanted to receive any financial support from the regulatory agency, which is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, we do have to participate in an application process that would require us to, build a proposal of what we would like funding to be used for, and it wouldn't be any long-term funding. So I just wanted to share that insight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. We're a little bit over time, and that's fine, because everyone here, all of you who have come, and MPs and senators as well, you're contributing to a culture of peace. Do we have? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Marty. We can't. Sorry, we're 30 minutes over. I'm so sorry.
Next year. And next year, this crowd will be so big, you'll need the John A. building, and to fill it up, I think you can get 500 or 600 people in that building. So that's what we're looking for. Thank you very much for contributing to a culture of peace. And it does have all of those elements. the element of eliminating nuclear weapons, the element of curbing global warming, I'm quoting Doug Roach, of providing a more equitable distribution of wealth, of ending the necessity for the forced migration of millions of people. All of these things fit together. Thank you very much.